now. So again, welcome everyone. I am Becky Facina. This presentation is Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities and Autism Spectrum Disorder. Thank you again to Charlotte and Taisha for organizing this. I absolutely love what I do, even though it's a little odd doing it over Zoom and virtually these days, because I really love that human connection. I still really find a lot of value in providing important information to the community and the agencies that we serve. So thank you again for organizing this. I'm going to continue to admit people. That's the other thing I wanted to say in my preface. So if I'm pause for a second, it's because I'm letting other people enter this training. So welcome, happy Thursday all. So I am, again, Becky Facina. I am with Alliance Health. I am their community education specialist in their Johnston County location, which is in Smithfield. We are the local management entity managed care organization for public behavioral health care in Durham, Wake, Cumberland, and Johnston County. So we have 4 catchment areas. We serve about 471,000 plus Medicaid eligible and uninsured individuals of over 1.7 million people. We manage their network of providers so that we ensure that quality care is received, as well as help individuals access care and navigate systems. That's something that I hear time and time again, that oftentimes people just don't know how to connect to care. They know that they need the care, they know that they need help, they are reaching out, but they just don't know how to connect. And system navigation can be hard. It's not as easy as we all think. I'd like to highlight Hope for NC right there on the right of this slide. It's that 855 number. It connects North Carolinians to additional mental health and resilience supports to help them cope and build resilience during times of crisis. Right now, we are living through the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is specifically there for those individuals that are dealing with crises around the COVID-19 pandemic. It's available to everyone in North Carolina's 100 counties. Hope for NC includes a crisis counseling program tailored for COVID-19. It provides immediate crisis counseling to individuals affected by the pandemic. And the initiative is in partnership with all 7 LME MCOs, which is Alliance is one of them, and Real Crisis Intervention Incorporated in Greenville, North Carolina. It's now available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to speak to a live person. So there we go. We talk about connecting to care, and this is one excellent way to connect to care. So let's talk a little bit about intellectual disabilities. And I'm going to preface this. This was one of the things I also wanted to say is I first did this presentation, and I still do this presentation for crisis intervention team members, specifically the officers that we are training to become CIT officers. And so that is law enforcement, EMS, we have firefighters, we have paramedics, those type of individuals that are going through the 40-hour CIT training. And I teach the IDD and Autism Spectrum Disorders portion of that training. And so originally, this training is tailored to meet their needs. But when we look at DPS and what you all do, there's a lot of overlap there. And so I took some of the slides out that were specifically tailored to law enforcement, but I left some in as well that I thought would still be pertinent to you. So intellectual disability, let's look at this. Intellectual disability are individuals with an intellectual disability. They have deficits in intellectual and adaptive functioning, which are observed during development, generally before the age of 18. So we're looking at these disabilities, we're noticing these disabilities and typically diagnosing them before the age of 18. When we look at the functioning, though, we're looking at 2 types of functioning, intellectual versus adaptive. And we said that in the prior slide in terms of the definition. And so intellectual functioning is the ability to reason, problem solve, plan, think abstractly, exercise judgment, and learn. So kind of those higher level functioning skills. Whereas your adaptive function is that day-to-day. It refers to the skills needed to live in an independent and responsible manner. That's like communication, social skills, self-help skills, getting dressed, feeding, money management, and shopping. Those are our adaptive functioning skills. The term developmental disability, it really means a severe chronic disability attributed to a mental, cognitive, or physical impairment or combination of mental and physical impairments, diagnosed or that become visible obviously before the age of 22. The condition is likely to continue indefinitely and limits the individual in 3 or more of the following categories and areas. And we talked a little bit about this in adaptive functioning. So self-care, receptive and expressive language, so being able to receive and understand language, but then expressing themselves, learning, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, economic self-sufficiency. The conditions create the individual's need for a combination of special interdisciplinary services, individualized supports, and other forms of long-term assistance that are individually planned and coordinated. So we're looking at long-term, right? This isn't something that we're diagnosed with. We get some tools, we may be prescribed a medication, and then we recover, right? This is not what we're talking about. This is a long-term, lifelong disability that we can give and teach tools and give them skills to be able to have and live a well, sorry, I have someone raise their hand, and be able to live a well and fulfilled life. But this is something that's going to be long-term. Infants and young children who have a substantial developmental delay or specific condition may be considered to have a developmental disability without meeting 3 of those or more of that criteria, if there's a high probability of meeting those criteria later on in life. Something that's interesting as well, and we'll talk a little bit about TBI later on in the presentation, is that North Carolina's definition of developmental disabilities, it includes TBI, traumatic brain injury, which may be acquired after 22 years of age. So we talked a little bit about age spans. So typically we see diagnosis prior to the age of 18, definitely by the age of 22, 2 in most cases, but then that TBI, so if you fall off your skateboard or you get into a car accident, or you have a grand mal seizure or a stroke, you may then qualify for services under TBI because it's later on in your life. It's after the age of 22. So I hope that makes sense to you all there. I'm going to admit a few more people into our meeting. So looking at diagnosis, it used to be diagnosed solely by an intelligence quotient test. So that's the IQ test. Current guidelines in the DSM-5, and that's the current diagnostic statistical manual. It's the 5th edition. It emphasizes the need to use both clinical assessments and standardized testing. So, but nonetheless, IQ scores are still used as a general guideline. Typically, they look at scores. So the scores on your IQ test mean something. So with a score equal or below 70 indicates an intellectual disability. Intellectual disability can be caused by a problem that starts any time before a child turns 18 years of age, like we said, but even before birth, so we're talking in utero. It can be caused by injury, disease, or a problem in the brain. For many children, the cause of their intellectual disability is not known. Some of the most common known causes of intellectual disability, like Down syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, some of you may have heard of Fragile X syndrome, genetic conditions, birth defects, and infections primarily happen before birth. Others happen while a baby is being born or soon after. Still, other causes of intellectual disability do not occur until a baby or until a child is older. They may not incur, these might include the serious head injury that I talked about, a bike accident, stroke, or certain infections. So we have our intellectual and developmental disability, and then we look at ASD, or autism spectrum disorder. So when we look at autism spectrum disorder, as you can see, can cause significant social, communication, and behavioral challenges. Oftentimes, we don't even know that there is a challenge or a disorder there. There's nothing different that sets them apart from anyone else. They may communicate, interact, or behave or learn in ways that are different from most other people. Learning, thinking, and problem-solving skills of people with ASD can range from gifted to severely challenged. Some people with ASD need a lot of help in their daily lives, and others need less or very little. I was a former exceptional children's teacher in Fairfax County, Virginia. And I had, before this change, so Asperger's used to be its own diagnosis. You may have all heard of Asperger's out there. And it now falls under the larger umbrella of autism spectrum disorder because it's on the spectrum. It's not its category in and of itself. But when we had students that were diagnosed specifically with Asperger's, I had several in my classroom, in my middle school classroom. And I would find them to be brilliant in certain areas, almost so that I have one little boy that I can think of clearly. His name was Adam, and he was infatuated with dinosaurs. And he had almost every dinosaur known to man memorized, and he created his own dictionary based off of the memory of the dinosaurs that he had learned and studied. It was fascinating and amazing. So he was highly intelligent in that one specific area, but very weak in writing or communicating. So really high skilled in some areas and low skilled in other areas. And you often would find that discrepancy when working with students on the autism spectrum disorder, and specifically Asperger's back then. A diagnosis of ASD now includes several conditions, which I just restated for you, that used to be diagnosed separately. So autistic disorder used to be its own separate diagnosis. Pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, used to be its own disorder. And Asperger's syndrome, it used to be its own disorder. Now these conditions are all called autism spectrum disorder. So when we look at diagnosing, it can be difficult. So there's no medical test, like a blood test to diagnose someone. Doctors really look at the behavior and development to make a diagnosis. It sometimes can be detected at 18 months or younger. By age 2, a diagnosis by an experienced professional can be considered very reliable. And I was actually shocked to hear that by age 2. But behaviors and developmental signs can be recognized very, very young, especially when it's coming from a parent and a caregiver that's interacting with them on a daily basis. However, many children do not receive a final diagnosis until much older. This delay means that children with an ASD might not get the help they need and fall further and further behind. Diagnosing ASD takes 2 steps, and that's a developmental screening and a comprehensive diagnostic evaluation. So really and truly, I wanted to give you a background of what the definition and characteristics of these syndromes and disorders are. But really the goal today, what I want to be able to communicate to you all as my audience, is that I want us to be able to increase our effective interactions between you and individuals with IDD and ASD. So in the chat box, I want you to think about, have you had an experience with a person who had an intellectual or developmental disability or an autism spectrum disorder? So think about that for a second. I'm going to put some more questions on here. You don't have to answer all 4 of them, but if you feel comfortable in that chat box, think about these and see which one, or if you can answer any of these, put it in the chat box for me. Under what circumstances did the interaction occur? Did you feel comfortable interacting with the person? Was the person able to communicate with you? And then finally, in what ways did your interaction with this person differ from other interactions? So I'm gonna just give you a moment, put your thoughts in the chat box. Typically, again, we do this in person and we have a conversation about it. Virtually, it's a little bit different. And I know some of you don't have the capability to use your mic, so please use the chat box there. And we're gonna have another activity coming up where we're gonna use the chat box as well. So Miss Charlotte, it was difficult to explain things where he could understand. Absolutely, sometimes that's right. The person received criminal charges, okay? Oftentimes we will, in our next slide, we're gonna, or in a few slides coming up, we're gonna look at that, how individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities factor into the judicial system. This person became frustrated and it showed in his body language, absolutely. interacting them through case management, have to explain things like their sentence information and earn time. Yep. So finding different ways to communicate is really important, and finding the best way to communicate with each individual is key. We will find in the next few slides coming up that one way is not the right way, and that every individual is different. And we're going to look at that in a little bit. So thank you for sharing that information for those that did. So I'm going to go to this next slide. This is the next activity I was talking to you about. And when I do this face-to-face, we have several of them. So I tried to pick one that we could do virtually that maybe it would go over okay. So this activity, I'll go ahead and show you the slide, and then I'll read it to you. For those of you that can use your mic, feel free to unmic yourself and do what's asked of you out loud. For those of you that don't have a mic, just go ahead in your office or at your home or wherever you may be, say this out loud, okay? I'm just putting a little caveat around that. You'll understand when we get there. Some of you may have already done this, but bear with me. So this requires your participation. I want you to be able to read the next slide out loud. You must read the color the word is written in, not the word itself. I'll reiterate that. You must read the color the word is written in and not the word itself. So if you can unmute yourself, go ahead and unmute yourself. The next slide will come up. Read down the columns from left to right. You're reading the color, not the word.
Green, red,
yellow, black, purple,
blue, yellow, black, orange,
red,
purple,
orange, green,
yellow,
orange.
green, red, blue, orange,
purple, green,
black, purple,
purple, yellow, red, orange, yellow, blue,
light blue, blue,
red,
yellow,
black,
red,
green.
orange.
Okay, so I'm laughing. Do you get what I'm doing? Do you understand?
That is so difficult.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. Now tell me how your brain, tell me what your brain was doing in that process.
Starting a migraine.
Trying not to read the actual word and look at the color, so it was kind of
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so even when you wanted to make yourself do it correctly, you had to read it much slower than normal, and sometimes you still got it wrong, right?
Yes.
Right. Yes.
So
What was the instruction again?
what's that?
What was the instruction again?
So when you look at this screen, what I wanted you to do was to read I have to go back now, because now I'm going to tell you opposite.
Color.
I wanted you to read the color and not the word. So that first one, your top left, you should have said green.
Green,
And then yellow.
yellow, blue.
Right. But what your brain wants to do, your brain wants to read yellow,
Yellow,
purple,
blue,
orange, blue, right? And it's very difficult. So this is an example of how difficult it is for students with learning disabilities to get through the day. Their brain understands what needs to be done, but they have to struggle to make it come out right. Just like you all, right? You understood the directions, I read it to you, but you really struggled to get it right. So not being able to do this activity correctly, it doesn't mean you're not smart, right? It just means that your brain wants to do something different. So thank you all for joining me in that activity. You'll get this activity in the slides if you ever wanted to use this again. I think it's a really great example of how your brain processes things, an example of an intellectual developmental disability. So if you have unmuted yourself, go ahead and remute yourself, and we'll continue on. Thank you all for sharing that.
That was
So what do you need to know? Okay, so we know that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and those individuals that have autism spectrum disorders, we know that they learn differently. We know that they process things differently. We know that lifelong down the road, they're going to need supports and help along the way. What else do we need to know? And this is really why I created this presentation. We need to know that people with disabilities make up the single largest minority group in the US. Individuals who have the skill set to work with this population, however, have a significant advantage over those who do not. Using the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, accommodations, it decreases the liability and improves community trust. And so this is a slide that I left in that I typically use in my CIT training. And so by law, people with disabilities are entitled to the same level of access to law enforcement services as provided to those without disabilities. Law enforcement can avoid liability by ensuring officers are trained to interact and communicate effectively with people with disabilities. It's important to increase community trust by demonstrating an understanding and acceptance of people with disabilities. Training for all occupations on IDD is rare, and yet the need is rising. And so I talked a little bit about crisis intervention programs, crisis intervention training programs, which sometimes includes the topic of IDD, but only briefly, are not mandatory or provided at all police departments. And the rise of incidents of some IDDs, such as autism spectrum disorders, like we talked about, and fetal alcohol syndrome disorders, heightens demand. And so I'm really proud of the work that I do in Johnston County with their officers and their agencies here and being able to train them on IDD, because a lot of officers and agencies don't get this information and have this training. So I'm proud that we have taken that on as a priority in our county. Citizens with IDD are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. People with disabilities are actually twice as likely to be victims of violent crime. Many citizens with disabilities end up in the criminal justice system with their disability playing a role in the situation that led them there. As suspects, they are highly suggestible and often desperate for connection to other people, making it that much easier for perpetrators to take advantage of them. Oftentimes we'll find that individuals with disabilities, specifically intellectual and developmental disabilities, they're the gophers. I show a really great video in my CIT training. Unfortunately, I didn't have the licensure rights to show it to you all virtually, but it's a police officer training video. And they interview a gentleman who is an actor, but they interview him. He is being charged with theft. And he just literally continues to say, yes, yes, I did it, when really and truly it was his brother that set him up to steal whatever it was that was stolen. And so oftentimes they become the scapegoat. IDD and mental illness are not the same, and they require different responses. I'll say that again. IDD and mental illness are not the same, and they require different responses. IDD is not a mental illness, and mental illness does not include IDD. Citizens with these two different disabilities require a different response, as well as different strategies for communication, resources, and supports. So they really do need different things. People with IDD have hidden disabilities that often go undetected. 85 to 89% of people with IDD have a mild disability, or what we all know as high functioning IDD. They often live in the community and may pretend to understand things when they do not, as I suggested with the gentleman being interviewed. They also had a really great clip of a young lady agreeing that she understood her Miranda rights when she really did not. We all come into contact with people with IDD more often than we realize. So what else do you need to know? If a crisis is unavoidable, minimizing use of force is crucial. I think that's in any situation, but we're talking specifically about IDD and individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Training officers should incorporate de-escalation strategies and/or protocols for working with people with IDD and other disabilities. Anytime use of force does occur, immediate medical response must be given to those exhibiting signs of or complaining of injury or illness following or during use of force. We'll talk a little bit about that. I think that's in every situation, but when we're looking at individuals that have IDD or that have specific autism spectrum disorders, they have physical developmental issues in their chest cavity area where their bone structure is not as solid and strong as others. And so oftentimes they have difficulties breathing, especially when laid on their stomach and on their chest. I love this slide or this photo. It's probably one of my most favorites. This is talking about community policing. And community policing, that approach works best for people with IDD, and it's not crisis intervention. So when we're looking at, we want to prevent instead of having to intervene during a crisis. Much of the training officers receive about disabilities is often focused on people with mental illness who are in crisis. We want to try and get away from that. Increasing the officer's understanding of disability through face-to-face interactions with people with IDD is key to avoiding crisis for both citizen and officer. And this is one I full-heartedly believe, is that building safer communities is a shared responsibility that should not fall to law enforcement alone. Having an awareness of disability issues in order to protect the rights and lives of people with disabilities is crucial, but this is a job law enforcement cannot do alone. They must have support from people with disabilities, the disability community as a whole and at large, and the larger criminal justice community to tackle this issue with success. And so we talked a little bit about what it is, but what does it look like? So how do I know if I were approaching someone on the street, what does it look like? And so it's different for everyone. And we'll talk about these traits. So possible traits may be limited vocabulary, difficulty understanding or answering questions, mimics answers or responses, that's also known as echolalia, unable to communicate events clearly in his or her own words, and then unable to understand complicated instructions or abstract concepts. Some of the other ones may be, they might not be able to read or write. They might not be able to tell time or not understand the concept of time. They may have difficulty staying focused. They may be easily distracted, and then potentially have some awkward or poor motor coordination. Now, those are the traits. So these traits may manifest themselves into behaviors. So traits and then behaviors. So some of these traits may be manifested in the following behaviors. So we may see some of these things. They may not want their disability to be recognized, so they try to hide it. So that's that yes man mentality. I'm asking you a question, I'm smiling and I'm nodding because I don't want anybody to know that I'm different. They may not understand their rights, but they may pretend to. They may not understand commands or directions. Specifically, when an officer speaks to them, they say what they think the officer wants to hear, or a person that's in charge, whether it be a teacher, an officer. And they may be confused. Again, this is related to officers or crimes. They may be confused about their part in the crime. They may even confess even though that they're innocent. Some of the other things we may see in terms of behaviors, an eagerness to please authority figures, like I mentioned, difficulty describing details, actions, or facts. So not being able to come up with the right words, leaving large parts of the story out. They may be overwhelmed by lights or police presence or people in general. They may not understand why they are being questioned or detained. They may try to start to run away. When they become upset, sometimes, excuse me, they may become upset, combative. They may act out and become emotional under pressure. They may display low frustration tolerance or impulse control. They may be often the last one to leave the scene of a crime and the first one to be caught. They might be easily led or persuaded by others. They may be unaware of the seriousness of situations. They may be unaware of social norms and appropriate social behavior. And oftentimes they may act younger than their actual age. They may display childlike behavior. So all of these things kind of to keep in mind that these are some of the behaviors that may be manifested. So that was IDD. Well, let's look at what's the difference between these autism spectrum disorders and intellectual and developmental disabilities. So what we find in autism spectrum disorders is that there is a spectrum, right? So we have low functioning autism and we have high functioning autism. We'll look at high functioning first. And so high functioning individuals on the autism spectrum, they may be verbal, right? They may be able to express themselves better in written language than spoken. They may be regimented and rigid. They may live independently, get married, have successful careers. All of these things look normal, right? I do really well with writing and speaking. I'm not so great with numbers, right? So all of those are just normal, everyday behaviors. But when we look at low functioning, sometimes they could be completely nonverbal. Frequently they have echolalia, or they're unable to live independently. They may be able to do simple jobs with supervision, sometimes not at all. And sometimes they'll have an uncanny mental abilities with specific tasks. And so what are we looking at? Interactions with individuals. They may have communication deficits, right? They may not read your facial language, your facial expressions, or your body language. They may have a delayed response to your question. If I am completely nonverbal, they may communicate with sign language or picture cards. And they may have sensory sensitivities. They may be sensitive to noises, light, touch. If we know those things, or if you know that you're interacting with an individual with ASD, the recommendation is to avoid touching them if possible. And don't misinterpret limited eye contact as deceit. Oftentimes we want people to look us in the eye. We know, if you're looking me in the eye, you're typically telling me the truth, or we're connecting. And that's not necessarily how individuals with ASD connect with others. Give direct, short instructions, such as stand up now, and avoid expressions like keep your hands where I can see them. Again, and this is when I was working with law enforcement. Keep your hands where I can see them. Well, they may really just walk up to the officer and put their hands directly in their face, because oftentimes they really take it literally. Also note that response to sensitivities can be aggression, which is why we say avoid touching individuals. So there's social deficits. They may invade your personal space. Again, I worked with a lot of students on the spectrum. And I had one little boy named Dimitri, whom again, I'll never forget. And he used to get, almost nose to nose with me to talk with me. He'd ask me a question about his assignment, and we would always have to kind of talk about, safe distance, comfortable distance. This is my distance that I'm comfortable. What space are you comfortable being next to me? Well, he always wanted to be right next to me. So we had to go over and practice that socially because we were saying, Dimitri, you can't go out into the community and walk up to a stranger and get directly into their face when you need to ask them something. So they're oftentimes over friendly, touchy, and wanting hugs. Dimitri was a great hugger, but again, talking about those appropriate social boundaries with him and teaching him what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Sometimes they may exhibit odd behaviors, and so sexually inappropriate behaviors. touching themselves, flapping hands or pacing. Again, I'll use my student as an example. I love Dimitri dearly, but he paced back and forth. He had a very hard time staying in a seat. And as teachers, you want kids to stay in your seat. You want them to be attentive, but also knowing in the back of your head what each student is struggling with and what their challenges are, to be able to give them that appropriate space to be able to pace. It's okay, you can pace. As long as you get your work done, as long as you're learning, it's okay, and you're safe, and you're keeping your boundaries, your social boundaries with everyone. Don't try to stop these behaviors, which may be the person's way of calming him or herself. And so, like I said, the flapping the hands or pacing, again, as long as Dimitri was safe, he wasn't invading other people's space, then it was okay. That was his way to kind of almost stay focused and stay on task. We talked a little bit about restraint earlier. If restraint is required, this is what I was referring to, we really recommend not to place individuals on their stomach or hold them from behind with their arms crossed in front of them. It may cause breathing issues, suffocation, or death because, again, their chest cavity oftentimes is not as developed as others, unless necessary to keep individuals from injuring himself, herself, or you. And again, there's that underdeveloped chest muscles. Seizures are often more common in individuals with ASD, so to be cognizant of that. So we've talked about IDD, we have talked about autism spectrum disorders, and now we're talking brain injury. And the interesting thing about brain injury is that brain injury can really look a lot like autism spectrum disorder. It can look a lot like IDD. The difference between IDD and a brain injury is that oftentimes TBI, a traumatic brain injury, happens after the age of 22. It's that stroke, it's a car accident, it's a fall off the bicycle, it's a skateboarding injury, something of that nature. And so when we see brain injury, oftentimes we're looking at memory loss, difficulty processing information, anxiety or depression, fatigue, sensory impairments. Also loss of physical function. So there may be a physical injury as well along with that brain injury. Disturbance in behavioral functioning. Changes oftentimes following a brain injury can affect how the person experiences life, interprets events, and responds behaviorally. Oftentimes they're not the same person that you once knew. So they may have trouble processing information, following instructions, again, headaches, fatigue, their level of frustration tolerance may be low. They may have difficulty perceiving how his or her behavior affects others. And this may be difficulty with impulsivity. Individuals may do or say things that are not always socially appropriate, kind of like, where did that come from? Or that really came out of left field. They may be perceived as belligerent or unmotivated. TBIs can possibly cause the individual to act out, again, in ways that they wouldn't normally act out. Important relationships can oftentimes become strained. And many individuals may have outbursts of anger, aggression, or crying. And again, those behaviors that are just out of the ordinary. It wasn't the same person that they once were prior to that brain injury. And again, emotional volatility. So what am I really saying in all of this? What's our takeaway from today? From all of the information, I'm not asking you to walk away here. You're not asking you to be a clinician. I'm not asking you to go out and diagnose. I'm asking you to be able to take the information and be better able to interact with individuals with IDD and autism spectrum disorders and traumatic brain injuries. Because what I'm really saying is that communication is key. When we figure out how to communicate with people, whether they're on the spectrum or not, our interactions are positive. Our interactions become better. So please remember, speak directly to the individual. Keep your sentences short. Break complicated instructions or information into smaller parts. Don't give them 5-step instructions. Break it down into 2 steps. Sometimes you even have to break it down into 1 step. 1 step, finish that step, move on to the next step. Be patient. It's a hard one to do oftentimes. Treat adults as adults, regardless of their disability. Remember, we said oftentimes that they may display childlike behaviors, but we need to treat them as adults. If you are unsure if the individual really understands what you are saying, ask them to repeat it in their own words. So, can you repeat that back to me? What was I asking you to do? If the individual does not seem to understand what you are asking, ask the question in another way. Be able to have these tools in your tool belt. Make eye contact before you speak and say his or her name often. Speak slowly and clearly. Take time giving or asking for information. Oftentimes we're in a rush to get things done. But again, going back to that, be patient. We need to take a couple steps backwards before we can take a step forward. You're not expected leaving today to be an expert on intellectual disabilities. Many individuals will have a caretaker that can give you advice on the best way to communicate with an individual. But always move forward with compassion and kindness in your heart. Are there questions for me? Talmadge Bennett, I just saw your I just saw your chat where it says, I'm colorblind. It was easy for you to do that task. That's wonderful. I think that's the first person that has said that that it was easy for them to do that activity. Questions or comments for me? I'm glad it was very helpful. Again, we try to condense a lot of information into a short period of time. I dug deep to try and find a video for you all that would really highlight the way I give this training to officers, but also highlight the way that I wanted to give it to you all, because I didn't want to give you the same presentation that I do for crisis intervention training. But it was very hard to find. It was very hard for me to find a video that I really wanted to show you all. So have they stopped teaching this to current police officers? So CIT training, it's crisis intervention team. And so no, it is across the state of North Carolina. We do, here in Johnston County, I believe there are 2 or 3 sessions every year. It is a 40-hour training. And I believe the officers need to be selected, or they need to sign up for it within their agency or their district. So go to your local, I would say, go to your local LME, MCO. I can provide that information for you. Go to your local police department and ask if there is a CIT trained officer on duty. I always tell individuals here, at least in Johnston County, that when they call 911 and they're having a crisis, they can request a crisis intervention team officer, which is really amazing. And they'll send an officer that is trained CIT out to their home or wherever they are located where they need that assistance and help. Anything else? Well, thank you again. It is 3:16. Again, this was session 4 of 10. So session 5 is coming up. I am so thrilled to be able to give this information to you every week. Happy to do it. Glad you guys have been here. I will email you the slides. Again, if you're interested in your local LME MCO, typically they all have one that's similar to me, not as wonderful and fabulous as me, but someone like me that provides trainings in the community and does outreach. So I will provide that information to you as well. And we will get this up on our YouTube channel for you to review and share at a later date. So thank you all. Happy Thursday. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.